Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, February 23rd New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's a start. Judges grow angry over Trump administration violating their orders. By Matthias Schwartz, Zach Montague, and Ernesto Londoño. The judge was angry. She had ordered the detained immigrant to be released in Minnesota, but instead he was let go in El Paso, where he had to spend the night in a shelter. All his property was supposed to have been returned, but the government was still holding his identity papers. "Why should I not hold you in contempt?" the judge asked a Justice Department lawyer at a hearing last week. Instead of answers, she got excuses. "I don't think there was ever any intention to defy the court's orders," said the lawyer, Matthew Isahara, a military judge advocate on temporary assignment to the Justice Department. "We were doing our best and things unfortunately slipped through the cracks." That explanation was not enough for Judge Laura Provenzino of the Federal District Court for the District of Minnesota. Last Wednesday, she found Mr. Isahara in civil contempt of the court. Legal experts said that her ruling marked the first time during Trump's second term that a judge had attempted to assert authority by issuing a civil contempt ruling, which enforces a judicial order by imposing a penalty until the offending party complies. In this case, Judge Provenzino ordered Mr. Isahara to pay $500 a day until the identity documents were returned. But the anger Judge Provenzino flashed at Mr. Isahara has been repeated in courtrooms across the country amid Trump's drive to deport large numbers of immigrants. A New York Times review of federal dockets found at least 35 instances since August in which federal district court or magistrate judges issued an order requiring the government to explain why it should not be similarly punished for violating court orders, essentially giving officials one last chance to explain themselves. Those so-called show cause orders came from judges in California, Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, West Virginia, and Puerto Rico. They all arose from cases in which the government had detained immigrants who had been living in the United States for years after entering the country illegally. They represent the culmination of weeks of frustration from the bench. Judges have castigated administration officials for testifying dishonestly, representing the law inaccurately, and above all, failing to comply promptly with their orders. Experts said the judges appeared to be grappling with a key question. Could the violations of court orders be explained merely by the stress on the legal system caused by the recent flood of immigration cases, or is there a more systematic effort by the government to defy the courts? "Don't hide the ball," wrote Judge Roy Dalton Jr. in Florida, complaining that a Justice Department lawyer had failed to fully explain relevant law in one case. "Antiseptic judicial rhetoric cannot do justice to what is happening," wrote Judge Joseph Goodwin in West Virginia, in another calling the warrantless arrest and imprisonment of thousands across the country an assault on the constitutional order. In a statement, Natalie Baldessari, a Justice Department spokeswoman, blamed rogue judges whom she accused of not following the law for allowing the high caseloads. The Trump administration, Ms. Baldessari said, was complying with court orders and fully enforcing federal immigration law. At first, the complaints were concentrated in Minnesota, where the federal bench has had to deal with legal aftermath of Trump's surge of immigration agents, but they have since spread. In New Jersey alone, the Justice Department admitted last week that it had violated judicial orders 52 times in immigration detention cases since December 5th. In court, Justice Department lawyers have generally responded like Mr. Isahara, with respectful apologies and beleaguered references to their workloads. But in some of their internal communications, the Justice Department's leadership in Washington has taken a different posture. During a call late last month with representatives from many of the nation's 93 U.S. attorneys' offices, Akash Singh, an Associate Deputy Attorney General, complained that judges' filing deadlines on detention cases were unrealistic and that some of their rulings were crazy, said a person familiar with the call who was granted anonymity to provide an account of an internal communication. And while Mr. Singh mentioned that the department planned to appeal some rulings, he also sounded a defiant tone. I want to stress that an adverse decision from a judge is not a reason to stop doing what you know is right, he said. We are the ones charged with keeping America safe. Publicly, too, the department has at times dismissed the significance of unfavorable rulings. Judge Provenzino's order is a lawless abuse of judicial power, said Daniel Rosen, the U.S. Attorney in Minnesota. Despite the aggressive rhetoric, the Justice Department decided to back down in Judge Provenzino's case. Last Thursday, the detainee's lawyer received an overnight FedEx package containing the missing identity documents. In response, the judge lifted her contempt order. Trump's sweeping raids have generated a flood of immigration cases in the federal courts. So too has a new administrative policy of holding immigrants without bond. Before, immigrants were usually released on bond if they were not deemed a flight risk or danger to the community. As a result of the change, thousands of detainees have gone to the federal courts to challenge the legality of their detentions by filing what are known as habeas corpus petitions. That pileup has been aggravated by a Justice Department staffing shortage so severe that some administration allies are publicly soliciting job applications from prospective prosecutors. The Justice Department has borrowed lawyers from the Department of Homeland Security and, in Mr. Isahara's case, the military. On the call with U.S. attorneys' offices, Mr. Singh said the department was trying to get more staffing. But in the meantime, he said, lawyers should expect to be working nights and weekends. As of Friday, Mr. Isahara alone was responsible for 104 detention cases over the past month in Minnesota, according to a search of the court's electronic case filing system. In written opinions and comments from the bench, judges have said repeatedly that they find the gripes about workload insufficient to excuse false representations and missed deadlines. In a sweeping order that demanded the government allow tens of thousands of detainees the means to challenge their detentions, Judge Sunshine Sykes in California noted that the volume of work was driven by the administration's own policies. Officials have chosen to avail themselves of these exact circumstances of which they now complain, she wrote. Noah Feldman, a Harvard law professor, said that judges appear to be assessing the possibility that the administration is purposely defying its orders, and if so, what to do about it. We're at a moment where the courts are trying to figure out whether the Trump administration is systematically ignoring court orders or whether it's a function of overload plus incompetence plus an attitude of disrespect, he said. For now, said David Super, a Georgetown University law professor, the government's lawyers were going to have to deal with their diminished credibility in the eyes of the bench. Judges are understanding about individual shortcomings, he said. They're less understanding about systems that aren't even trying to get it right. The number of court challenges to immigration detention has skyrocketed since last summer, when the Department of Homeland Security began holding immigrants without bond. Judge Sykes in Central California noted that her district had received 551 petitions over a 5-week span. A judge in New Jersey found 547 petitions had been filed over 9 weeks there. A judge in the Western District of Texas said that as of January 29th, there were 134 active cases, with another 20 to 25 arriving each week. The influx has put a tremendous strain on the resources of the legal system, wrote Judge Tiffany Cartwright in Washington State. It has forced hurried and frustrating hearings, wrote Judge George Russell in Maryland. Judge Clay Land in Georgia wrote that the situation had become an administrative judicial emergency. In an email, Judge Elizabeth Wolford, the chief of the Federal District Court for the Western District of New York, said that the volume of habeas petitions in her district, which has only 4 judges on active status, had risen more than tenfold in the past 6 months to roughly 100 filings each month. This is just not sustainable, she wrote. Judges have been equally vocal in condemning the government's failure to promptly comply with their orders. It's not their job or temperament to seek confrontation with the executive branch, said Professor Feldman. But, noting the unusually pointed judicial language, he added, if they feel their orders are not being followed, they know that's the definition of a challenge to the rule of law. Earlier this month, Judge Nusrat Choudhury of the Eastern District of New York assailed the Trump administration for not only defying 2 clear and unambiguous orders, but also offering false statements about the whereabouts of a man Immigration and Customs Enforcement had detained in Long Island during a routine check-in. 6 days after she prohibited the government from moving the man outside the metro area, Judge Choudhury wrote, the government placed him on a flight to Texas, then into detention in New Mexico. 2 days later, she wrote, an ICE official submitted a declaration giving her a false assurance that the man was still in New Jersey and would be present at a hearing she had called for the following day to consider his release. When the man, still held in New Mexico, missed that hearing, she tallied 2 separate violations of her orders and told the government to return him to Long Island and release him. Judge Choudhury, an appointee of President Biden, wrote that she considered holding officials in contempt over the violations, but decided against it because the detainee could not afford to pay a lawyer to file a motion. In an opinion last October, Judge David Briones of the Western District of Texas complained that a man he had ordered to not be removed from his district had been abruptly sent to Arizona and then deported to Mexico the next day. Judge Briones, a Clinton appointee, urged the Justice Department to tighten up its coordination with the Department of Homeland Security, to fix inconsequential lapses that lead to irreparable consequences for parties and violations of court orders. Further mistakes, he added, may lead to sanctions or criminal contempt. And for a real change of pace, here's another interesting article. The Rise of Eyes Began with Just One by Carl Zimmer. Look at just about any vertebrate, and you'll see 2 eyes looking back at you. Falcons circling overhead have 2 eyes, just like hammerhead sharks roving through the ocean. Scientists have long puzzled over how the vertebrate eye first evolved. A pair of new studies suggest a strange beginning. Our invertebrate ancestors 560 million years ago were cyclops, with a single eye at the top of their head, scientists now propose, that only later split into 2. Charles Darwin fretted a lot about the exquisite complexity and sophistication of the vertebrate eye as he developed his theory of evolution. The eye to this day gives me a cold shudder, he confided to his friend, the American botanist Asa Gray in 1860. Somehow, evolution had produced the eye from many parts, such as the lens and retina, through tiny changes through the generations. Darwin couldn't say for sure what that sequence of changes was, but he was encouraged by the diversity of simpler eyes among invertebrates. Some are mere lumps of pigment that detect light. Others are simple cups lacking lenses. When I think of the fine known gradations, Darwin wrote to Gray, my reason tells me I ought to conquer the cold shudder. Yet opponents of evolution continued to cast doubt on the idea that eyes could evolve. Even in the 1990s, creationists claimed that natural selection would need many billions of years to produce an eye, far more time than life has existed on Earth. Dan Nielsen, a neurobiologist at Lund University in Sweden, grew so annoyed by these claims that he estimated how long it would actually take for a patch of light-sensitive cells to evolve into an image-forming eye. I thought, heck, that's an easy calculation. Let's do that, he recalled. In 1994, he and Suzanne Pelger, a colleague, concluded that an image-forming eye could evolve in just a few 100,000 years. It's not precise in any way at all, but it goes to show that there is plenty of time for eyes to evolve. And I'm going to evolve into saying, you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The model only addressed how the shape of eyes evolved. In actuality, many other changes occurred along the way. New proteins had to emerge that could bend light in the lens, for example, while others absorbed light in the retina. In 1994, scientists didn't know enough about those microscopic details to develop a hypothesis for how they evolved as well. 3 decades later, that's no longer the case. There's lots of molecular data now that we can use that's extremely powerful, said Dr. Nielsen. He and other vision experts have now joined forces to develop a hypothesis for how vertebrate eyes evolved. You look at all the evidence in your head and it suddenly clicks, said Tom Baden, a neurobiologist at the University of Sussex. They and their colleagues unveiled their detailed scenario for the evolution of vertebrate eyes on Monday in the journal Current Biology. What we've done is we've provided a plausible set of steps that got us there, said Dr. Baden. The scenario starts about 560 million years ago, when our invertebrate ancestors lived mostly buried in the ocean floor. They stuck out their brainless heads to filter bits of food floating by. On the top of their heads, Dr. Nielsen and his colleagues proposed, these forerunners of vertebrates possessed a single patch of light-sensitive cells. Those cells tracked the cycle of day and night, setting the animals' body clocks, and also provided simple clues about their position, so that the animals could keep their heads just high enough to eat without being eaten. Some of the descendants of this cyclopean ancestor left their burrows and started to swim. They were still simple creatures with tiny brains, and they still filtered food from the water they swam through. But now they needed more information about their environment. Their single eye grew more complex. Cup-shaped depressions evolved on either side, sensitive to the direction of incoming light. Different light-sensitive cells become active depending on where they sat along the curve of the cups. Dr. Nielsen and his colleagues argued that these were the forerunners of the retinas in our eyes. An awareness of the direction of light helped the animals travel through the water, enabling them to stay upright and stable. It becomes dimmer in a large part of the visual field and not in another. That tells you that you're tipping in one direction or another. Over millions of years, our filter-feeding ancestors evolved into tiny fish, complete with brains and mouths that they could use to catch live animals. Dr. Nielsen and his colleagues contend that this transformation could not have happened without an additional change to the eyes. There's a better place for them on either side of the head, Dr. Nielsen said. As these proto-retinas moved to the sides of the head, the wiring between the light-sensitive cells made new connections, producing sharper vision, Dr. Nielsen and his colleagues propose. These early fish could now sense the flow of their surroundings as they swam forward. It provides a whole new way of moving through your environment and avoiding obstacles, Dr. Nielsen said. But as the new eyes migrated to their new positions, the animals still retained the ancestral eye on top of their heads. While it could not provide details about their surroundings, it continued to provide vital information, such as the overall level of light. Modern fish still have a light-sensitive patch of cells on top of their heads, known as the pineal gland. It's a compelling new idea, but the jury is still out, said Karthik Shikhar, a computational biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, who was not involved in the study. One way to test the idea, he said, would be to compare the activity of cells in the pineal gland and the retina in many vertebrate species. If Dr. Nielsen and his colleagues are right, the cells in the two organs should have deep molecular similarities, a sign of the deep evolutionary link. Dr. Baden said that he and his colleagues were starting to make those comparisons in zebrafish. This is the start, he said, not the end. But new fossil discoveries suggest that the evolutionary course of eyes may have taken some surprising turns that Dr. Batten and his colleagues hadn't envisioned in their hypothesis. In recent years, paleontologists in China and England have been studying some of the earliest vertebrate fossils, which date back 518 million years. These show traces of eyes on the sides of the head, complete with lenses and retinas. But at the top of the head, there's a second pair of eyes, complete with lenses and retinas. Jakob Winter, a paleontologist at the University of Bristol, speculated that early vertebrates, small animals hunted by big invertebrates, may have benefited from the extra-wide field of view that four eyes provided. I believe that the reason why they got four eyes is because they were at the bottom of the food chain, he said. Dr. Nielsen speculated that the extra eyes might have evolved thanks to a drastic change to vertebrate DNA. Some studies hint that early in the evolution of vertebrates, the entire genome was duplicated. An extra set of genes may have given rise to an extra pair of eyes. Dr. Winter said that the vertebrates may have later lost the extra pair of eyes as they evolved into top predators. As you move up the food chain, you don't need to have distributed vision, he said. The eyes become a little obsolete. Vertebrates might have lost their extra eyes, but the ancient light-sensing tissue on top of their head endured. As fish came on land, the pineal gland survived, and humans still have it in our heads today. In mammals like ourselves, however, the pineal gland has sunk into the dark depths of the brain and can no longer detect light directly. Instead, light signals from our eyes get relayed to the pineal gland, prompting the neurons there to release different hormones depending on the time of day. Our pineal gland barely holds on to its ancient legacy as our original eye. Future experiments may reveal more about how the vertebrate eye evolved over 500 million years. Until then, Dr. Nielsen said, he'd love a time travel machine to see if his theory is right. Just give me 1 hour back 600 million years ago, he said, so I could look at those animals that were there and see what kind of eyes they actually had. I spend a lot of time in New York, and so this article is of great interest, at least to me. The article is called Dog Poop Wars. In New York, the snow is foul, and so is the discourse, by John Leland. What does New York City look like now, 3 weeks after a winter storm blanketed the city in pristine white snow? On a one-block stretch of Riverside Drive on Wednesday between West 89th and West 90th Street, a pedestrian had to step around 37 deposits of decaying dog poop. Joggers two-stepped through a foul obstacle course. Dog walkers bent to clean up after their own pets, leaving their neighbors' sins behind. People pushing strollers or wheelchairs could only hope for clean passage and then maybe wash their wheels when they got home. From the start of the snowfall, a certain category of dog owners seemed to think that the city's so-called pooper scooper law, surely the heart of the social contract, no longer applied. Or, as a sign taped to trees in one neighborhood scolded in verbose lowercase type, just because you are entitled and it's cold does not mean that it isn't rude, disgusting, pathetic, and illegal to leave your dog's feces on the sidewalk. If the city didn't exactly go to the dogs certainly went to the city. And this week, the reverberations sounded far beyond the 5 boroughs, somehow escalating in Congress to the introduction of a Protecting Puppies from Sharia Act, co-sponsored by 8 U.S. representatives. As of Tuesday, the city's 311 line had received 888 complaints about dog waste this year, up from 519 over the same period last year. In theory, the Department of Sanitation can issue $250 summonses to people who don't clean up after their dogs, but only if an agent catches them in the act. The odds of this are slim. Last year, after a spate of 311 complaints, the department ran week-long surveillance stings in Washington Heights, Harlem, Morningside Heights, and Flatbush, which yielded a total of 0 summonses. Outside New York, communities and apartment complexes have taken high-tech measures to cut down on dog waste, requiring registries of doggy DNA samples to connect errant droppings to their sources. A company called Poo Prints, based in Knoxville, Tennessee, claims to have created registries for more than 1.2 million dogs in 8,000 localities. In Japan, it's customary for dog owners to spray water or disinfectant after their dog urinates or defecates. New York is not currently considering any of these measures. Instead, this week the city got a lesson in what happens when the stuff hits the social media fan. What started as a hyperlocal tweet about fetid sidewalks mushroomed into an anti-Islamic slur, death threats, and calls for a U.S. representative to resign from office. Nardine Kizwani, a prominent pro-Palestinian activist, was one of the people annoyed by all the dog waste, especially when she was pushing her 8-month-old child's stroller in her Brooklyn neighborhood. So she posted on X, where her comments have regularly become lightning rods for conflict. Finally, she wrote last Thursday, New York City is coming to Islam. Dogs definitely have a place in society, just not as indoor pets. Like we've said all along, they're unclean. The post was partly a nod to the anti-poop movement and partly a dig at people who had warned that Zohran Mamdani, the city's first Muslim mayor, would institute Sharia law if elected, Ms. Kizwani said in an interview. I didn't think it would be anything controversial, she said. It was just satire. Just satire is a dangerous phrase. So began a war of words that spread to Florida, London, and Washington, D.C. The next day, the Daily Mail, a conservative British tabloid, ran an article under the headline, since changed, famous Palestinian activist calls for dogs to be banned as indoor pets in New York City because they are un-Islamic. Then on Sunday, Representative Randy Fine, a Florida Republican who has previously made Islamophobic remarks on social media, took up the canine cause. If they force us to choose, he wrote on X, the choice between dogs and Muslims is not a difficult one. The backlash was swift, from Democrats, if not from Republican legislators. Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, called Mr. Fine an Islamophobic, disgusting, and unrepentant bigot, and a disgrace to the United States Congress. Gavin Newsom, the California governor and a likely 2028 Democratic presidential contender, posted, "Resign now, you racist slob." Mr. Fine has not backed down. As calls for his resignation mounted, he continued to ride the social media moment, announcing legislation that would ban federal funds to any state or local government that considers dogs haram. He named 7 Republican representatives as co-sponsored and added, proceed accordingly, Mamdani. The weather, too, is not through with New York. The forecast suggests more snow this weekend. For those weary of the increasingly challenging sidewalk shuffle, the neighborhood poop wars may perhaps begin anew. I was walking through New York one winter during the snow, and I mentioned to my daughter who lives there that there were a lot of yellow spots in the snow. There must have been a tremendous number of dogs. And she said, it's not the dogs, it's the squirrels. So I'm happy not to be in New York. Here's a kind of helpful article. This is a guest essay, and it's by Emily Oster, and it's called Let's Stop Getting Distracted from This Crucial Question About Exercise. February is the month things go south in our exercise routines. The excitement of New Year's resolutions fades, and the dark and cold keep us in bed rather than on the treadmill. That's true. This is a shame because regular exercise is really beneficial. It can control high blood pressure, improve mental health, and reduce falls among older adults. A review of 187 randomized controlled trials covering nearly 30,000 people found exercise lowered mortality risk by 13%. Given the fact that people struggle to stick with exercise, the crucial question is how can we design fitness programs that maximize long-term adherence? Unfortunately, a lot of research and media coverage is focused instead on asking what the best type of exercise or the optimal amount is. Is walking better than tennis? Is running better than swimming? Is it really important to do 80% of your workout at 60 or 70% of your max heart rate? These questions serve as an engaged population and promise that with a bit more knowledge, you can maximize your health. The trouble is, they are basically impossible to answer well, and most of the answers we get are misleading and wrong. But you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The best way to discover the optimal exercise regimen would be with large randomized trials. While we have high-quality studies comparing some exercise intervention, often a combination of aerobic exercise and weightlifting, to doing nothing, it's far harder to find trials comparing two different types of exercise head-to-head. That's because you'd need enormous sample sizes to detect the most likely small differences in a statistically meaningful way. Big trials are expensive, and not everyone wants to stick to a randomly assigned exercise program. Because of these challenges, most of the evidence on the so-called best exercise comes from what are known as observational studies. Instead of randomizing people to different programs, these studies ask people about the exercise they already do and compare their health outcomes to those of people who do more or less exercise, or who do different types of exercise. The trouble is that such studies almost always confuse correlation and causation. To take a specific example, a recent paper found that swimming didn't lower mortality, but running did. Does that mean swimming isn't effective? No. When you look more closely at the data in the appendix of the study, it's clear what is going on. Swimmers were much less likely than runners to engage in other positive health behaviors. For instance, only about 5% of frequent runners in the study smoked, but among frequent swimmers, it's 11%, just shy of the US average. Swimmers were also more likely to have high blood pressure at baseline, way more, and have a family history of cancer. One explanation is that doctors may recommend swimming as a low-impact activity for people who already have higher health risks. Even if the swimming helps, the other differences among people hide that. Although the authors adjust for differences in the variables they can see, there are many differences they can't observe, and those will drive the results. It's also why you should be very skeptical of the conclusion from the same paper that walking and running a lot are beneficial, but frequent jogging, essentially slow running or fast walking, is not. A study like this tells us plenty about the types of people who do different exercises, but that's not actionable. People want to know what would happen if they changed their behavior. These issues are common in exercise research. A 2019 study argued that the benefits of walking leveled off at 7,500 steps a day, suggesting that this was a threshold number. But when you look at the paper, it's clear that the people who walk more are also more likely to do other healthy behaviors, like not smoking and positively eating well. A 2025 paper used wearable devices to suggest that 1 minute of vigorous exercise is equivalent to 1 hour of light activity. But it doesn't sufficiently take into account that the mere ability to engage in vigorous activity is most likely already a sign of better health, or the fact that, like with the earlier study, there are other clear differences across groups. Again, the authors make statistical adjustments to account for the differences they can see in the data, but they can't control for all the factors associated with different exercise patterns. I could go on. People love findings like these, but the reality is that when we see such claims, we should assume that they don't tell us much. They can even backfire, making people feel inadequate about exercise programs that are actually fine. The limits of our knowledge are a tough pill to swallow, especially since it's not just exercise. The research on nutrition is equally shaky. It can be frustrating to know that there are some questions we'll never answer. I also think it can be freeing, an invitation to let go of optimization and focus on what we do know. In the case of exercise, we can say with confidence that it's good to exercise regularly and to do something that raises your heart rate. People also want to know how much exercise to do. This is also very hard to know. The randomized studies showing benefits of exercise typically aim for 2.5 hours a week. After that, we're mostly relying on lower quality observational studies. Those show that the benefits of exercise tend to flatten at around 7 to 10 hours a week. What we do know is that people are more likely to stick with an exercise program that's tailored to their preferences and lifestyle. When doctors are advising patients about exercise, they should be as open as possible to the variety of ways people might want to get moving. Research should focus on which approaches are best to lead to long-term sustained exercise habits, ideally research with randomized trials. The type of flawed observational research discussed above gets in the way of both of these priorities. It takes research time from studying what matters, and it creates misleading and constraining advice. It doesn't really matter which exercise people do. They just need to do it past February. And here's another really interesting, I think at least, essay. One of the Bible's greatest moral revolutions, and this is by Shai Held. A hallmark of the second Trump administration has been the hunt for foreign-born, from children to adults, criminal status apparently notwithstanding. Many of the administration officials who champion this project often invoke God in their speeches, asserting that their allegiance to the Constitution is rooted in their fealty to a far older text, the Bible. It's clear that many of our leaders lack the most fundamental understanding of the central biblical commandment to love and care for the immigrant. The Bible explicitly commands 3 loves. The first and second, many modern Christians and Jews cite easily: love of God and love of one's neighbor. The third, and most often overlooked, is love of the ger. Several English translations interpret ger as sojourner, someone born elsewhere who has come to dwell among the people, most likely temporarily. Other translations render the word ger as stranger, alien, or foreigner. In recent decades, some biblical scholars have returned to an older idea, that ger should be translated as something close to immigrant. Writing about the book of Exodus, the 11th century Jewish biblical commentator Rashi explains that wherever ger occurs in scriptures, it signifies a person who has not been born in that land where he is living, but has come from another country to sojourn there. The word immigrant matters in this context. It reminds us that in the ancient world, just as now, someone seeking a home among people foreign to him had likely endured significant upheaval in his life, like war, famine, political oppression, or economic crisis. The commandment to love immigrants is one of the Bible's greatest moral revolutions. Other ancient Near Eastern cultures instructed people to care for widows and orphans. The Bible expands the category of those who deserve special protection to include those who live among our community but are not quite of it. There is no one-to-one correspondence between the biblical mandate to love the immigrant and the question of how many immigrants the U.S. should take in over a given year. But this does not mean that the Bible has nothing to say to our present moment. On the contrary, the Bible offers an ethos, an approach we might take in confronting immigration policy. Those of us who follow the Bible as a moral guide can conclude that demonizing, mocking, or dehumanizing immigrants, let alone violently pursuing them, is religiously speaking an abomination, a direct affront to a biblical vision of what a good and holy society ought to look like. Xenophobia is then, spiritually speaking, an illness, a failure to see people as God does, to treat them as God demands they be treated. The book of Exodus explicitly forbids the people from mistreating an immigrant. Contrary to popular assumptions, the prohibition on abusing the vulnerable does not derive only from the children of Israel's past experience of slavery and oppression. It is a basic demand of morality. We must not take advantage of the weak. The people's memory of having suffered in Egypt amplifies and intensifies a demand that is already in place. Don't take advantage of the vulnerable. The book of Leviticus repeats the injunction not to impress, then adds a mandate to actively love the immigrant. These commands resurface in the book of Deuteronomy, which implies that loving immigrants is a way of emulating God's love. Readers of the Bible are thus invited to engage in a double act of moral imagination. First, they must imagine that they themselves, and not merely their ancestors, were redeemed from slavery in Egypt. And second, they must ask themselves who in their midst is most vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. The biblical text also admonishes societies to offer immigrants legal protections, fair wages, and social benefits like harvest gleanings and tithes for the poor. In a truly good society, the immigrant cannot be left dependent on other people's generosity. The law must also ensure his well-being. The immigrant was protected by the law, but was also obligated to observe much of it. The Bible commands the people to love and protect the stranger, but it also expects at least some degree of assimilation on the immigrant's part. Those of us who treat the Bible as authoritative in our lives are aware, through the very text we cite most often, that unchecked, unbridled power is always abhorrent, let alone when it is deployed to attack precisely those who are most vulnerable. Well, that was a positive article. Now here's another one that won't make people happy. Historians confirm tomorrow won't be better than today, by Ian Baruma. To live in Berlin under the Nazis during World War II must have been an extraordinary experience. To be deported to death camps, if one was one of the tens of thousands of Jews who were still alive and living in Berlin, was horrific. For non-Jews, living in a police state was frightening enough. Being bombed day and night in the last 2 years of the war was surely terrifying. The terrorism of the Nazi state was often in plain view. If you lived in Grunewald, one of the wealthiest parts of Berlin, you could have seen Jews being marched to the railway station from which freight trains packed with humans left for the ghettos and death camps in Eastern Europe. Others would have seen neighbors dragged from their homes. In some cases, they could have heard the screams of prisoners in the forced labor camps that were spread all over the city. And yet most people looked away, pretending to see nothing, and carried on with their lives. Why? As is so often the case under autocratic regimes, from Hitler's Berlin to Mussolini's Rome to Vladimir Putin's Moscow, things go from bad to worse in stages. Today's outrage is tomorrow's normal. People adapt and get used to it. My interest in what happened in Berlin during the war was sparked by my father's letters from the Nazi capital between 1943 and the end of the war. A student in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, he was deported to Germany as a forced laborer. His life was far from normal, but even as an unwilling foreign worker, he was able to observe the daily life of Germans, who often appeared to be oblivious to the horrors taking place around them. In a letter to his sister during winter in 1944, when Berlin was being bombed day and night, he described a concert by the Berlin Philharmonic, conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler, with the audience and the musicians huddled in thick coats under a roof filled with holes from British and American bomb shells. Almost until the last stages of the war, when the Soviet army conquered Berlin in a devastating battle that reduced the city to rubble, the cinemas were full. The dance reviews were in full swing. The soccer competition went on, and people visited the zoo and sunbathed on the Wannsee opposite the infamous villa where the logistics of the Holocaust were worked out over glasses of brandy. One reason for public docility in terrible circumstances is fear. In the last years of the war, a Berliner could be arrested and often executed for doubting the final German victory, for defeatism. But there is something more insidious, something not familiar to many of us today, the hope that things will turn out all right soon, that the political outrages are temporary, or at least that they can't get worse. One way of dealing with bad times is to pretend that they're normal. This is the problem when the destruction of moral norms and the rule of law is incremental. Germans should have known that politics would take a criminal turn as soon as Hitler and his brutal paladins gained total state power in August 1934. The racial laws of 1935 robbed Jews of their civil rights, but Jews made up less than 1% of the German population, so most people could live with the racial laws. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria and grabbed a chunk of Czechoslovakia. Okay, perhaps that would satisfy the Fuhrer's imperial lust. He surely wouldn't go any further. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, it was clearly too late for normal life to resume, but even then, many Germans believed that Britain and France would not resist. Surely the war would soon be over. Erich Ahlenfeld, a Jewish banker married to a Gentile wife, wrote a letter to Goering asking to serve in the invading army. After all, he was still a German patriot. He never got an answer. And so life continued. People kept hoping that the next act of war and assault on decency would be the final one and the nightmare would finally end. Even in 1945, when terrifying Soviet artillery was within earshot and much of Berlin lay in ruins, there was still hope that wonder weapons, fearsome missiles that would destroy and demoralize London, or machines that would pull Allied bombers from the skies like giant magnets, would turn things around. The human capacity for hope is an essential quality. Without hope, there can be no improvement. But hope can also turn into delusion. The United States today is not Hitler's Third Reich. We are nowhere near the disastrous circumstances of Berliners in 1945, 1939, 1935, or even 34. But as humans, we are prey to similar kinds of deception. When Trump refused to say whether he would accept the outcome of the election in 2016, people should have sensed the danger, and yet at the time, respected intellectuals told me that everything would be fine. All he wanted was to play golf or make money. Anyway, Hillary Clinton and George Bush were worse, for they condoned or unleashed unnecessary wars. I was told by a well-known American historian that there was really nothing to worry about, for after all, Roosevelt once had authoritarian tendencies too. Democracy would never be shattered, a law professor assured me, for Americans love freedom too much. Since then, one red line after another has been crossed. Undocumented immigrants are called animals. Civilian boats are blown out of the water. American citizens are gunned down in the streets and then accused of being domestic terrorists. Universities, news organizations, and law firms are being bullied and blackmailed. And refugees are deported to countries whose languages they probably don't even speak. And that's aside from the blatant corruption of family and cronies. All this was incremental too, but compared with 1934, everything goes much faster. And yet life continues as usual. What was unthinkable only yesterday, we now take in stride. And we wait for that moment when things really have gone too far this time, when the fever breaks and things will revert to normal. But that moment probably won't come. Things have gone too far too many times already. Hoping for better is still the right attitude, but only as long as we prepare for the worst. And in the last few minutes, let's take a look at some of the letters to the editor. This one is from Brian Tucker of Boston, who is snowed in today. Any momentary elation I felt from reading the first analysis of the Supreme Court's decision as some kind of genuine rebuke, at long last, of President Trump's executive overreach evaporated after his news conference on Friday. True to form, he reverted to aggressively asserting his right to do as he pleases. With this decision, Chief Justice John Roberts may think he's demonstrating the independence of the judiciary, but it isn't so. Mr. Trump intends to continue circumventing any laws and restrictions whatsoever. The various other workarounds available to him, particularly a section of the relevant law that no other president has ever invoked, allow him to make good on his stubborn insistence that he doesn't need Congress to continue imposing his will on U.S. and world trade. The court victory is therefore an empty one indeed. And here's a short letter from Ellen Steinbaum, also of Boston. She's also snowed in today. Welcome as it may be, one decision does not define a court. We can hope, but independence is something shown over time. Jeffrey Greif of Towson, Maryland writes, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, in his dissent in the Supreme Court tariff ruling, wrote about a substantial mess that could ensue in any refund process. Yet when the court overturned Roe v. Wade, no such mess seems to have been considered despite its close to 50-year history versus the 1-year on and off history of Trump's tariffs. And here are some letters on PEN America defending its record on free speech. This is a letter by somebody, Summer Lopez and Clarice Sharif, and they're the co-chief executives of PEN America. PEN America rejects the claim that its decision to withdraw a January 29th statement on the cancellation of performances by an Israeli comedian reflects capitulation to a pressure campaign or signals a turn away from the organization's mission to uphold free expression. Last year, PEN America issued nearly 250 press statements, but statements are not all we do. We are leading the fight against book bans, mobilizing resistance to government attacks on academic freedom, and supporting writers facing safety threats. We have defended Jewish and Israeli as well as Palestinian writers and academics who have been targeted and canceled. We continue to oppose ideological litmus tests as conditions for artistic performance. We know that any given statement may be taken out of context and met with charges of bias, but we refuse to be silenced by that risk. And here's a letter from David Behrman of Houston. If I thought it would do any good, I would get on my knees and beg that the remnants of the Republican Party, those who remember what it means to be a conservative committed to the Constitution, the rule of law, and efficient governance, plainly and publicly reject Trump and his MAGA movement, then back candidates who reflect their traditional values. Now, I understand that would mean losing elections, but it might also mean restoration of some self-respect and the possibility of a conservative future cleansed of the red stains. And you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio reading service. This is Ted. Again, I hope you enjoyed it and found it worthwhile. And I'll speak to you again next week. Thank you for listening.